Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Martha Rogers, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel. And our topic today focuses on the influx of immigrant unaccompanied children into the United States, which has been pretty newsworthy over the past few months. There's been a marked increase in the number of children crossing our southern borders on their own. And I've heard some of them are even as young as 2 or 3 years old. Can you imagine? The majority of these children are risking so much, including their lives, to take this dangerous trip. And in my opinion, the United States seems to be caught by surprise with this flood of undocumented and unaccompanied children. Now, unaccompanied children have been entering the United States for decades, but recently the number of children seeking safety in the United States, particularly from the Central American countries, has really skyrocketed. I saw that the National Immigration Justice Center has provided legal counsel to thousands of unaccompanied children for about the last 2 decades. And their clients used to be mainly teens, males, and their 13s and 14s. But now this Justice Center has seen a dramatic increase in females and in the age, especially younger children needing their services. And the processes and the systems that children must navigate doing this, they're so complicated. Many states have different reactions to the children's presence, and many faith-based ministries have reached out to them. And the effort of those individuals is in direct contrast to Iowa Governor Terry Branstad's statement when he said that sheltering such children sends a false message to those that enter the country illegally and think they're welcomed. You know, as a Christian, I'm reminded of the story of the Gospel of Matthew in his 2nd chapter, and the title of a story in there is called The Flight to Egypt. To save themselves from persecution and from harm and possible death of his infant son, Joseph takes his small family across the border of one of the nearest countries, and he escapes into a safer land. The infant boys that were left behind were murdered and massacred, and the families were torn apart, treated harshly and unfairly. Now that's my Christian story. But running as refugees away towards safety seems to be an ancient theme, and it's matched by the theme of if you don't run, you face death and torture. And now it appears that these themes are repeating themselves again today, but now with children, young, unaccompanied children who speak a different language than us. It's fear of death or harm or persecution that they run from, but what do they find when they arrive? And these questions provide us with a multiple of ethical and moral and humanitarian issues, and they're all very culturally sensitive. So these are the thoughts I'd like to explore as a basis for our discussion this morning. And to help me do that, we have a panel of a distinguished and accomplished guest, and I'd like to introduce you to them at this time. Immediately to my left, I'd like you to meet Ann Grove, who is with Operation Threshold. It's a community action program, and we'll hear more from Ann on that in a moment. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you.
And Gunda Brost is next. She's an immigration attorney out of Cedar Falls, and we welcome you, Gunda.
Thank you.
And Jessica rounds out our panel. Jessica Brackett is with the Eichner Foundation and the 1,000 Kids for Iowa. Jessica, why don't you tell us a little of what brought you here today, what the Eichner Foundation is trying to do in Iowa?
Sure. Well, the 1,000 Kids for Iowa project is trying to find homes in Iowa for refugee children. At this time, about 15% of the children do not have sponsors or families and are being kept in warehouse-like facilities. And we believe that they should be in individual homes. We're also identifying resource networks in the communities that we're working in to help the children. And we're also developing a network of volunteers to augment those systems where possible.
So you're in direct organization and process for placing children into the variety of resources available in Iowa.
Yes, yes, we're building capacity around the state to assist these children.
Thank you. And Anne, why don't you tell us a little bit about your connection with Operation Threshold and what that's about?
Operation Threshold is a community action agency, works on issues of poverty and people who are at risk. And our program is the Cedar Valley Refugee Newcomer Services Program. So our purpose in being is to try and help people feel welcome in the community, get through the hurdles through casework, and then to help teach them to solve problems themselves and to advocate so that they can take their full place in our society the way we want them.
Direct on hands, whether they're children or adults, I would imagine. Well, thank you. And Gunda, you're an immigration attorney. Tell us what you do.
I represent, it's astounding actually that in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a small place, people would maybe from outside of Iowa would consider the middle of nowhere. There's people from all over the world in our community. And I have, clients from all kinds of different areas in the world. And, some of them have legal claims based on, they entered legally and then they, want to adjust their status, and others do not. They come without papers, and so, I get a smorgasbord of different kinds of cases in my small office, so it's quite interesting. But I think that I speak for most of the immigration attorneys. It's not at all unusual to get a different variety of different cases, no matter where you are. So,
I'm sure there are a lot of differing needs out there.
yes.
I get confused when I hear all the different terminologies used to describe the children that are coming in from Central America. I hear unaccompanied minor children, I hear immigrant children, I hear refugees, and can any of you throw any light on the difference and maybe what we should use as a terminology to consider when we're talking about these children? Is there a difference between an immigrant and a refugee, or?
Yes, well, a refugee is somebody who, is outside of the United States, and they have to go to the United Nations refugee office, with their claim of persecution, and then if they qualify, they are admitted as refugees into the United States. An asylee is somebody who is asserting a claim of political or social or based on national origin or ethnic group. They're basing a persecution claim and they live within the United States. So there's a big difference already between an asylee and a refugee.
So an asylee, excuse me, one who is seeking asylum because of their persecution?
Correct.
And a refugee is one who has been forced to flee for self-protection?
And are seeking from outside the United States.
So they get their status when they live elsewhere. So these children who make it into the United States undocumented are more likely to become asylees if they're granted asylum, or if they're a victim of human trafficking, they might get a special visa for that. There are some options there that may happen, but there's so much that goes into winning one of those claims. It is not an easy or a fast process.
Well, and then how does the word immigrant fit in with all of these other terminologies?
I would say that is an overall term for somebody who, whether legal or illegal, under the immigration laws, is trying to remain in the country. So.
And I should clarify that we use the term refugee and asylee because we believe that these children are running from war. Even though the United States has not defined them as refugees, looking at the conditions that they come from, they are leaving war-like conditions, and that's why we use the terms that we do. Even though we know that the U.S. government does not call them refugees.
So as a group, their needs are varied, but are you seeing any patterns in this? Like you mentioned escaping from war, but yet we hear too the personal dangers some of them just have trying to go to school and maybe being raped on the way, or with drug lords and all these other stories I hear on the news. Are there patterns to these kinds of behaviors the kids are fleeing, or is it just overall like a war situation for their safety?
violence in these countries has increased dramatically over the past few years, and that is in large part due to cartels moving their operations from ocean-based transporting of drugs to land-based transporting of drugs, and that is why we're seeing the drastic increase in violence and in murder. Honduras is the murder capital of the world, and El Salvador and Guatemala are right behind.
I've read that too. It amazed me. So for just living and breathing purposes, the kids that are coming across unaccompanied are really fleeing for their life and safety, aren't they?
Guatemala is actually the murder capital of females in the world. And so a lot of the people in the Artesia Center are women and children together. So that's also an interesting group to consider.
So that population flees with parent and a child to come in together.
Yes, typically the mother and children or child, yes.
So when they flee and if they make it to the United States, what kinds of greeting do they find when they arrive? Again, as far as the terminology being varied, where they are picked up or where they meet America for the first time, it seems to me that a lot of those systems are varied too. How do they get into the United States system?
Some of them go directly to the Border Patrol with the expectation that they will be taken someplace. Some, I'm sure, don't do that by choice. But what Department of Homeland Security has been saying is that Border Patrol agents have suddenly found themselves having to deal with all these children, and they're human too. We may not agree with their choices and what their job is, but they have been called to be more than they've ever been before to try and help these children get to someplace, be someplace safe, I think Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just have the basics, food, shelter, and clothing, and a very rudimentary health screening before they can be transferred over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement's custody and move forward. Does that match?
Yes, that is typically correct. They are processed through the immigration system where they are, checked for their medical health and trying to be placed with somebody that, like a family member or a community member that they know. So they are making efforts, to place them with somebody, as you were saying, with a home rather than with a detention center.
And they say, I think 35 or 45 days is the average right now. The Office of Refugee Resettlement is saying that they stay in one of their facilities, and then they're trying to make sure that they are placed with someone in a more appropriate home-like setting.
It was 35 days. I think the Office of Refugee Resettlement will keep the children up to that amount of time. But I also noticed that when they do go to an ORR, that's easier for me to say, shelter, they're isolated. They're kept in a shelter. They don't go out for school or for training or for...
There's a reason for that.
Okay.
And I guess from my point of view, it's a solid reason. If you have seen people who have been really recently traumatized and you're popping them in another culture, when you toss them immediately in within the first 35 days out into the schools, and maybe it's a school they'll have to transfer from because they're going to go somewhere else, you're reshocking the system over and over. So that's a stabilizing period. The goal is to try and check on health and well-being, gather some information, do the background checks. So from the outside it may look harsh, but I guess having watched children try to adjust when they're bounced right into regular society, even kids that were joining their refugee parents, I saw really struggle in that first month. It's really hard.
Well, thank you. That makes a lot of sense, because at first my mind was thinking it was like a detention camp and that it would be more punishing, but what you say makes absolute sense, that it's a time of some stability, some calming down, a chance to find friends or locate family or resources for the youth. But then how do they get out after 35 days? How does 1,000 kids for Iowa get names, or how does?
Well, at this time we have no agreement with the federal government that children will be placed through our program. We are at this time working on building our capacity to 1,000 homes, and then we will approach federal officials to identify maybe the structure that we could use to place children in homes.
So you're being proactive and getting the processes and placements organized.
Yes.
Before the children arrive, and it's that shock again of, oh, another change, another place that is new or unfamiliar. I see. How does immigration then legally track these kids? What kind of challenges are there? I read that there were 62,900 children as of mid-August, according to the Health and Human Services tracking, that have come across from Central America. How do you keep track of almost 63,000 children and find placements for them?
Part of it is having a broad network. The reason ORR is involved with this is because they've worked on a national basis before with unaccompanied children, minors, and so they have a network that from Catholic Charities and the Lutherans that work specifically with foster parents for foreign-born kids. They have a network that is supposed to have the capacity, although I think this has probably stretched it way far, to try and find those children's the right connection. So if they get word, oh, there's a family member somewhere, they have somebody to go out and investigate that. Is this in fact the truth? That's ideally what you would have happen, that you talk it through the sponsor agreement then, so they have to do paperwork both for the standard AR-11 form that you use for anybody who's foreign born and doesn't have citizenship status. I think almost all of them have to do AR-11 forms, and that's a fairly easy process. But then there's another agreement where the sponsor is required to keep track of the child, say if there's a move, and they give them materials on what happens if your child disappears within the first 24 hours. This is what you're supposed to do with that. So you know that there is some real concern about that traffickers might get them, or the kids will be so traumatized that they might run. So they're trying to set things in place to deal effectively and compassionately with the kids. And I think compassion is at the heart of things. I won't say it always works that way, but I think, like the Iowans I know too, we all feel that compassion for a child who's been traumatized and want to see things work right. And that's where people who will step up may really make a huge difference.
And Iowa has a unique history of welcoming refugees. In the 70s, President Ford sent a letter to governors across the state asking them to welcome East Asian immigrants and refugees into their states. And Governor Ray, Republican Governor Robert Ray, led an effort to bring thousands of these refugees into Iowa. So we really have a history of welcoming refugees.
Iowa has a great history and a lot of inclusiveness, and I'm proud to be an Iowan in that way. But then my mind just spins with all these rules and regulations, and I'm thinking, Gunda, with what I've read about the court processes that George W. Bush brought in, and was it in 2008, and said they're all due fair process in a hearing to decide if they're a refugee or an immigrant or Tell me about that. What have you seen?
That is precisely correct. You cannot, at this point, at this venue, when you are dealing with an unaccompanied child, say that this person is an illegal or undocumented immigrant, because they need to first, they might have immigration relief available to them. They may qualify for political asylum. They may qualify for special immigrant juvenile status. If they were victim of a crime while they were in the United States, they may file a U visa. So we cannot determine until they've either exhausted their attempts to obtain immigration relief or they have been ordered deported. We cannot really say that these people are illegally here. That is to be determined, and that is why Bush, what they were doing is precisely what needs to be done. Now the immigration judges are completely overloaded with these. They already are overloaded with caseloads and casework. So with the influx of all these new cases, it is really presenting a administrative nightmare.
I imagine that goes along with funding too, then, because any government branch is funded just such X number amount of dollars, and when you've had another 63,000 youth come through that need some type of legal or court resource, I imagine the funding through the government is stretched, never mind the funding at the same time when you're looking for housing or sponsors or home placements or relatives. It seems like there's a lot happening all at once for the children once they enter the system, if they can be tracked.
Yes, I mean, in my opinion, we want to look at the long-term consequences of now we might be funding, and it might be an issue to fund these attempts to integrate these children in our communities. But if we consider the human potential that they have, you know, they are at an age where they can really integrate into our culture and learn English and become productive citizens. If we think about that, that will down the road pay back some of these costs that we have to be concerned about.
Their
obviously.
gifts and talents, if treated well now, will far outweigh the costs we have to pay up front,
That's
I
right.
imagine.
And there are also a coalition of lawyers working around the state to get these children represented. Justice for Our Neighbors is an organization that does pro bono immigration work, and they've taken on a number of these cases. There's also the Caring Cities campaign out of Davenport, which is working with lawyers from the University of Iowa to do trainings around the state for lawyers who may not be immigration lawyers but want to help these children. So there is an effort around the state by lawyers to get organized and to help these
The
children.
caring program out of Davenport, the mayor is really involved there and welcoming and saying, let's get proactive, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
the city of Davenport's really rallying around what can we do.
And Justice for Our Neighbors is a wonderful organization. You know, I've seen them in action in immigration court. They represent some of these undocumented children for free, and they've really reached out to the immigration attorney community to try to find people to come in and represent them for free. So.
And one of the challenges with that is when you're dealing with kids who are traumatized, to go with a claim of asylum, the kids are going to have to relive to be able to restate what happened to them in many cases. The paperwork's very specific, so another adult can't say, well, they just told me this or that. Those children are going to have to be able to do that. And one of the things that I am really hoping someone will step forward and do is fund some of the play therapists and some of the trauma-informed therapists to help so that when they are meeting with an immigration attorney or an advocate, there is a way to really get the information that's needed. Without that information, their claims will be denied.
And they have to be specific. I have experienced X, so therefore I deserve to be a refugee or have asylum.
Yes, I need to show that they fear harm or have experienced harm based on being, you know, either in a particular social group or being a member of a specific race or ethnic group or nationality. Or gender.
Or individual harm they've experienced.
Yes, that would probably fall under the particular social group.
And I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if the children are found just to be fleeing for a chance at safety but haven't been harmed, they are repatriated back to their country in a way that's not harmful again to them. Is that so? It looks like you have an opinion.
There is a concept in international law, and help me with this, called refoulement. If someone is a refugee, for example, and the government where they're at wants to send them back home, if they're sending them home into danger, international law says you can't send them back someplace where they're going to be killed, where they have a really good chance of that. In my opinion, if America does that, and it is only my own opinion, we are probably pushing that issue.
Well, precisely, and the problem is that just because you're fleeing from poverty or just because, you know, the situation in your home country is abysmal, you cannot go to school because you have to work in the fields, you know, your parents have abandoned you with your older brother, that is not necessarily, does not qualify for an asylum case because you cannot necessarily show that on the protected grounds that you deserve asylum. So that is often not enough.
That's a hardship, but not a harm to your personal safety and security.
Yes, it does not necessarily provide you with an immigration status, which, you know, it's terrible, because under international law, we should be protecting victims of this kind of crime.
You have to draw a line somewhere, I imagine.
And we are hearing stories of children who are getting sent back being killed.
Yes.
I mean, that is the reality of this situation. And I'd like to step back and go back to the counselors that you had mentioned. Part of our network, so we've identified over 1,500 individual offers of support. So we've got counselors, doctors, translators, folks like that. And we have a number of counselors who have signed up in our network and are willing to do volunteer work with these kids along those lines. So we're really building an effort of people who want to help these kids and are willing to put in their personal time to do so.
That makes Iowa proud, to be able to say we're supporting not just resettlement needs, but looking at the emotional needs or the moral needs. I worry about education. We haven't talked about that much. And it is, as I understand the law, and Gunda, you can help me, any child that is in the United States, once they're in the United States, has a right to education. Is that correct?
That's correct. There was a Supreme Court case that decided that. So anybody, whether documented or undocumented, if they're within the United States and they're at the age that they're supposed to go to school, they have the right to attend an education, a public school.
And that means our school officials need to be ready for that, because you don't know where family will be. So any teacher, any principal might find that, oh, somebody in our community is family to one of these children and they're here, and be able to dive in and help them. Even if it's what they're not used to, even if it's different, they have to do it with refugee groups. Whoever you are, we say we will educate young people, and we understand the importance of that for our democracy. It's supremely important in my mind, just hugely.
Even some of the human and health or the resettlement shelters are doing education within the system to keep the children as much as they can on some learning curve. But I know the needs will be great, because if you're emotional or fear or anything gets in the way, that sets back the education, and it inhibits the gifts you talked about earlier. So what is, we have to come to some conclusion now. So what does the general Iowan need to know? What parting words might you say as far as involvement or resource or support, or is it even necessary to support?
I would say that in terms of housing, there is a fear that these kids will be put into, well, according to the federal plan that came out a couple weeks ago in the Washington Post, the federal government is looking at building another facility, a large facility, a private prison, for-profit prison, to house these children in Texas. And so we are worried about the long-term housing of these kids. And so I would just encourage folks to get involved with the 1,000 Kids for Iowa network to help build capacity so kids will not have to be put in facilities like that, and we can put them in individual homes here in Iowa.
A lot of what you hear in the news or in the media, it is appealing to emotions, you know. Like illegal alien, undocumented, secure the borders, define what that means, securing the borders. I mean, those are terms that evoke people's emotions, but know the law, know that some of these children have a legal right to be here, and we can't just say they're all illegally here. That needs to be, that's what we need to find out. And so, you know, as an ordinary citizen, I would say, confront those when you hear those kind of conversations. Confront the misconceptions that are there, that are just appealing to the emotions. Get involved in your communities. Do something positive. This is a turning point in history. Think about, you know, when they didn't have marriages between different races. I mean, at one point that was considered normal. And so I think we're at a threshold in history right now where 20 years from now people will look back and see, well, how did we deal with this? And so it's very important how we do deal with this.
And work with your faith community. Many of the faith communities are doing lots. So lots of opportunities